Welcome dear audience, students and scholars. Here I am Dr. Amjad Ali. Dear scholars, in this video we are going to discuss a case study related to inflation and unemployment in the United States. Dear scholars, because inflation and unemployment are such important measures of economic performance, and macroeconomic developments are often viewed through the lenses of Phillips curve. Because Phillips curve is the combination of relationship between inflation and unemployment, which we have discussed in our previous videos. So let's see the historical overview of inflation and unemployment in the case of United States over the period of 1960 to 2008. We have here unemployment and inflation. So this graph displays the history of inflation and unemployment in the case of United States over the period of 1960 to 2008. And this data spanning almost a half a century illustrates some of the causes of rising and falling inflation and unemployment in United States. This figure uses annual data of the unemployment rate and the inflation rate, which is measured with the help of GDP deflator. So let's see the further explanation of this rising and falling relationship between inflation and unemployment. During 1960s, the 1960s showed how policymakers can in the short run lower unemployment at the cost of higher inflation. The tax cut of 1964, together with expansionary monetary policy, expanded aggregate demand and pushed the unemployment rate below 5%. This expansion of aggregate demand continued in the late 1960s, largely as a byproduct of government spending for the Vietnam War. So unemployment fell lower and inflation rose higher than the policymakers intended. During 1970s, the 1970s was a period of economic turmoil. The decade began with policymakers trying to lower the inflation inherited from the 1960s. President Nixon imposed temporary controls on wages and prices, and the Federal Reserve engineered a recession through contractionary monetary policy, but the inflation rate fell only slightly. The effects of wage and price controls ended when the controls were lifted and the recession was too small to counteract the inflationary impact of the boom that had preceded it. So by the 1972, the unemployment rate was the same as a decade earlier, while inflation was 3 percentage points higher. While the further discussion of during the 1970s, beginning in 1973, policymakers had to cope with the large supply shocks caused by the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. OPEC first raised oil prices in the mid-1970s, pushing the inflation rate up to about 10%. This adverse supply shock, together with temporarily tight monetary policy, led to a recession in 1975. High unemployment during the recession reduced inflation somewhat, but further OPEC price hikes pushed inflation up again in the late 1970s. During 1980s, the 1980s began with high inflation and high expectations of inflation. Under the leadership of Chairman Paul Volcker, the Federal Reserve doggedly pursued monetary policies aimed at reducing inflation. In 1982 and in 1983, the unemployment rate reached its highest level in 40 years. Unemployment aided by a fall in oil prices in 1986 pulled the inflation rate down from about 10% to about 3%. By 1987, the unemployment rate of about 6% was close to most estimates of the natural rate. So unemployment continued to fall through the 1980s, however, reaching a low of 5.2% in 1989 and beginning a new round of demand pull inflation in the case of United States. Okay, during 1990s and 2000s. Compared to the preceding 30 years, the 1990s and the early 2000s were relatively quiet. The 1990s began with a recession caused by several contractionary shocks to aggregate demand, tight monetary policy, the saving and loan crisis, and a fall in consumer confidence coinciding with Gulf War. The unemployment rate rose to 7.3% in 1992 and inflation fell slightly. Unlike in the 1982 recession, unemployment in the 1990 recession was never far above the natural rate, so the effect on inflation was small. Similarly, a recession in 2001 raised unemployment, but the downturn was mild by historical standards, and the impact on inflation was once again slight. A more severe recession beginning in 2008 looked like it might put more significant downward pressure on inflation, although the full magnitude of this event was uncertain. Okay, that's the US macroeconomic history exhibits the two causes of changes in inflation rate that was encountered in the Phillips curve equation. The 1960s and the 1980s show the two sides of demand pull inflation, and in 1960s low unemployment pulled inflation up, and the 1980s high unemployment pulled inflation down. The oil price hikes of 1970s show the effect of cost push inflation in the case of United States. So this is all about the case study of inflation and unemployment in the United States. So see you with another video. Ciao.